Welcome to WROL broadcast, the Is It Worth It edition for Hush. I'm Doombawkz and I'll be filling in for Haymail today, so it's a pleasure to make all of your acquaintance. Of course, if you don't know me, I do an insight and discussion series on characters, guides such as this in a way. So I'm going to go ahead and approach it in that same manner. We're going to go over their background, their abilities, their orders, both legendary and what you're going to want to put resources in first. And then beyond that, we're going to talk about his synergies, his counters, who he counters, and finally we'll go ahead and cap it off with some teams that perhaps you should try. So, without further ado, let's get into it. Thomas Elliot is a physical villain, a bit on the slower side. He is only about 109 speed at maximum gear rank, making him a fair bit slower than a lot of the main meta threats, but he is still faster than a good amount of characters that you're going to want to have him around for. His other stats that have the main point investment in them in terms of his gear is going to be his strength, which, all things considered, even with a 915 boost, isn't all that high, and his stamina, which is also considerably lower. He himself only has about 28k health, so he's definitely on the squishier side, and you are going to want to definitely consider options that might increase his longevity, though he does have them in his kit. Speaking of, let's go ahead and transition over to his kit. First, of course, we have his Precise Scalpel Incision. This is his basic attack. Does damage to an enemy, not a very high amount mind you, but still a respectable amount of damage, and has a 60% chance once fully ringed out to silence the target. You will generally want to fully ring this out as soon as possible. This is what you're going to get the most of out of his kit, because it's tied to both one of its passives and his duel. I would definitely say that it's worth the early investment just to get the highest power level possible out of it. However, that being said, if you wanted just to spec it up to the additional chance to silence, that's also not necessarily going to cripple the character. You will get slightly less output from him, but if the cause is just to be disruptive, then that's the way to go. For his legendary, he gains 5 mins. Now, of course, we have to consider the fact that this does make him a very easy trigger for Wonder Girl. However, because we've just gone over that his vitality is a bit on the lower side, we must consider that fact, and also consider that for what it's worth, 5 mins, that's roughly going to be about 12.5% of your health, give or take a few. And having that loaded up with 10, 15, 20 can make him surprisingly hard to bring down over the course of a match if the opponent can't land multiple solid hits on him. So, all in all, I would say that that is a medium priority. I would say that you're going to want to do that legendary maybe 3rd or 4th, really depending on what you need. It's not going to make or break the character, but it's one of those things that it's a nice to have but not necessary. Next, we have King's Gambit. You have an 80% chance to gain 3 awareness. Hush will use his first ability on the target, and you have a 70% chance to use it twice. Then it forces the enemy to attack him. Now, some things to keep in mind, of course. This operates as an assist call style move, so if you were to try to use it on an invisible target, you will not attack them, because you can't quote-unquote assist call against invisible enemies. However, they will still attack you back, so keep that in mind. Now then, as far as the ability itself goes, it's very easy to try to draw comparisons to this and Arcus's issue challenge, but there are some very key differences that you need to be made aware of. First, the second hit is not guaranteed, unlike with Arcus, meaning that the burst damage is going to be a fair bit lower and more inconsistent. Likewise, you don't gain the death or debuff immunity, instead you're gaining just awareness. Now this can be good or bad. It does prevent you from losing health and helps you make the most of the rest of your kit, especially some legendaries we're going to find later on. However, it also carries the issue that once those awareness are gone, you basically don't get the longer value of the things that Arcus brings. Also, considering, of course, Arcus puts a taunt on himself and has a retaliation effect, so he really synergizes a bit more strongly with his duel than Hush does with his. However, one must consider, again, that this is where the bulk of your damage is going to come from. This is going to allow you that good chance of smacking twice with that decently high crit chance, meaning that you have a pretty decent likelihood of either debuffing and crippling someone's kit, or outright killing a character if they're, say, a blue or lower health red. Combined with a different passive that we're going to see later on, you will see that a lot of damage output can come from this ability. But at the same time, it's unfair to compare it to Arcus' Duel, because let's be frank, Arcus' Duel is probably one of, if not the best ability in the game. So, all things considered, I would recommend scaling this out a little bit, but really, unless you're going for that double attack, then the awareness is really going to be the only benefit you see from ringing it out. You can ring this out, and I would probably recommend ringing it out immediately, since this is where a lot of your damage is going to come from. But all in all, if you don't ring it out, it's not like you're really losing all that much. Just a little bit of protection in the long run. The legendary for this gives him debuff immunity before the attack. So, considering this, how good is this ability, all things considered? Well, we've all seen how good debuff immunity is on Arcus and other characters, but beyond that, of course, it allows you to approach certain characters in a way that you wouldn't be able to before, like, say, Red Hood. Normally, you would want to avoid doing this to Red Hood because he's going to fire back with his pistols and you're going to end up taking 20 bleeds. But instead, if you use this, you don't actually end up taking any bleeds. So I would say that it's probably one of the stronger aspects of his kit, and it is probably something you're going to want to spec into first or second, because this is an ability that you are going to generally be using with Hush. Now, the next we have Hush Little Baby. Damage to an enemy, and then you can apply an extended silence to the target. Now, keeping in mind, despite the fancy wording of it, an extended silence is just a 2-turn silence. There's really nothing special about it, but for Hush, that actually ends up making a big difference because of the passive that he has that we're going to be discussing later on. Now, of course, this is just your big bulk damage. It's going to be the swinging arm that comes down and smacks an opponent in the face. And thanks to his execution type passive, it is going to be very handy as a kill shot of sorts. Now, that in mind, his legendary ability gives him 80% turn meter up if the target is killed. So, in this regard, you have the capability of taking multiple turns in a row. And in fact, with certain combinations, you basically guarantee yourself multiple turns in a row in this case. Is it worth it? I would say probably so. This is probably going to be something you're going to want to spec into a bit earlier. This is probably going to be your second if the King's Gambit Legendary was your first, because that 80% turn meter really helps to overcome his issue with being slower and not being able to maintain momentum as well. Next, we have Revel and their demise. All of Hush's attacks deal an additional 40% damage to targets that are under 60% health. Now, for most of you that have played matches, you will notice that the damage output in those matches is so high that being under 60% really isn't that hard of a thing to do. Keeping in mind also, though, this is a bit hard countered by the existence of someone like, say, Lex Leader, who can just keep his teammates perpetually overhealed. Something to consider, but it actually is really, really good as an ability against opponents that maybe don't have that kind of long-term sustain. The legendary for this gives you invisibility after using King's Gambit. Now, of course, this means that after attacking, you just are able to remain hidden and protected for a bit of a longer period after your duel, giving you a chance to heal up. Personally, for this one, I would recommend it maybe fourth or last. This would definitely be a good one to get after you get the Scalpel's Mins, because it allows you to gain more benefit from said Mins. However, without that legendary in place, there's not really all that much point to having the invisibility. It's fancy, but honestly, you could do without it, and you won't really see any issues with the character's performance. Finally, we have Enjoy the Silence. If an enemy is attacked by, or if an ally rather, is attacked by a silenced enemy, sorry about that, you have a up to 90% chance to counterattack with your scalpel. And of course, you gain permanent strength up each time an enemy dies. This is that synergy that I was discussing earlier with the silences from his scalpel and from his Hush Little Baby. Putting this on an enemy more or less guarantees that you're going to be able to maintain a near perpetual silence on that character. So if you set it on a character that you desperately need to lock down, like say an Arcus, who you really don't want to duel, then you'll be able to more or less ensure that he never has that ability to duel, because he's just constantly going to have only his basic to go off of. And an Arcus who can't shield and can't duel is a surprisingly weak character. And this goes for a lot of characters. You can target someone who maybe is your enemy's only source of purge, and you have a chemo on your team. All of a sudden, that Doom is sticking a lot harder than they were expecting. Or you could put it on, say, an opponent who you really don't want to see use their big buffing ability. Like, you could put it on a Robin, and all of a sudden that Robin has a much more inconsistent time going invisible. Or you could put it on a Hippolyta or a Cheetah, and then all of a sudden those characters are basically reduced to just doing the very bare minimum amount of damage that they could be doing. This is especially true for Hippolyta, who is more or less defined by her ability to use multiple buffs and those assist calls and those big impactful turns. If you make it so she can only use her basic, she's basically dead in the water. The legendary for this, of course, you gain strength up each time an enemy dies. That's handy, but you're going to see only relatively limited use over the course of a match, unless your opponent is running a revive comp. This is because, obviously, there's only 4 people to kill. 3 strength up isn't really worth a legendary point for a lot of people, especially considering by that point the strength becomes ultimately irrelevant. However, this does allow him to really hard counter certain team comps, like, say, a Cersei team comp or a team comp that runs Grundy or White Lantern Sinestro. All of a sudden, you're not just gaining 3 strength ups, you're gaining in the area of 8 or 9. And you can even, as cruel as it may be, sit there and harvest those characters in order to boost up your damage to the point where nothing will be able to stop you. No one that remains will be able to really prevent you from going crazy. So I would say this one, you're going to want to get this one probably last, but honestly, at this point, it's just a matter of it does less for his kit, not necessarily that it's a bad legendary. Now then, let's talk about resource management, and let's go ahead and talk about legendary order, and put maybe a more specific, defined order in it. So in terms of resource management, as mentioned in the skills ability area, you are going to want to probably spec out precise scalpel incision as much as possible, because that's where you're going to be finding the most damage out of your kit. In terms of Hush Little Baby, I would recommend extending that one up until you get the 15% bonus chance to do your extended silence, because that guarantees it, and that's really what you want, is to make sure that you get that silence on somebody. As far as King's Gambit goes, I would probably recommend going up to level 5 initially just to get that extra double strike chance, but beyond that, the rest of it is a pretty heavy investment just for the another 10%. So really that one's up to you as a player. If you feel like you're going to be using him as a much more heavy damage character and less so as a disruptive character, then you're going to want to spec it up earlier. But otherwise, you could probably leave it be. 60% is plenty serviceable. In terms of his passive level and their demise, you are going to want to max this one as soon as possible. That extra 40% damage is going to be what gives you the oomph in your kit that he lacks otherwise, and is also going to make your counterattacks a lot more dangerous for weakened foes. In terms of Enjoy the Silence, because it has such a specific gate, I would probably actually recommend leveling this up to maybe the area of 75% or 80%, around that range, because that's really all you need. Going for the full 90% is going to probably be a bit of a heavy expenditure that isn't really going to pay dividends in the long run. As far as a specific legendary order goes, I personally would probably recommend something in the avenue of 2, 3, 1, 4, and 5 in that specific order. That is going to give you the general most value up front of his kit, while still giving you some decent things to work towards. Mind you, I believe that he's about L2 viable, give or take. So really you only need the first 2 abilities to get the most out of it, but the rest of the abilities are pretty good gravy, so don't be afraid to do that. Now, mind you, if you're going for a more control style game where you're going to want to maximize that longevity, you're probably going to want to go for something like 2-1-4-3-5. Because for you, the turn meter up is a bit less important. You're not planning to have him to kill the opponent. You're more just having him there to last as long as possible and cause as much trouble as possible. So, with that, let's go ahead and go over counters and synergies. First up is Cheetah. Now, Cheetah provides a lot of upfront value that Hush loves. For one thing, her initial acceleration and that extra strength ups really helps Hush get his game plan going without having to wait 2 or 3 or 4 turns in order to reach that point where he can start really laying into people. Of course, you also have the advantage that she can ravage and purge enemies out of his way. She provides a lot of bleeds, which she appreciates the extra silence disruption around because it prevents people from purging them off. And all in all, he's just a character that can make it so that you have more turns in order to gain more value and have more chances to proc that extra blood in the air, which just gives him even more damage, so on and so forth. Really, it's a self-feeding cycle that works out really well. So I would definitely recommend Cheetah to be one of those main synergies. Next, let's talk about Medfill. Now, of course, Medfill, the lowly B-tier Medfill, that poor guy, but he provides a heck of a lot for Hush's game plan. So, first things first, damage immunity and acceleration. Medfill has these in spades. Throw damage immunity on your Hush and then send him into duel. It doesn't matter if the opponent hits him or not. It doesn't matter if he gets the awareness or not. He's just going to tank those hits regardless. His Hypnotic Light allows you to slow down enemies, allowing Hush to stack on multiple stacks of silence across the entire team. Meaning that eventually you're just going to be fighting a bunch of people who can only basic attack, and you are getting progressively slower and slower and slower. Medfill also has the benefit of being able to taunt up and protect Hush when his invisibility is down. And also you have the benefit of gaining those extra mins, which is great, but it's not really the key points. So it's definitely worth it to consider that Medfill might be a very good leader option for you, especially given his leader legendary, where you have a chance to also apply turn meter down when you're hitting someone. That can end up being very impactful over the course of a match when Hush is running around, dueling people, slapping silences on them. And then, in addition to that, slowing them down in terms of their acceleration, definitely something to consider. Now then, we also have the obvious choice, Lex Luthor. Not only does he provide a bit of silent support with his beam, but he also provides a huge amount of healing for Hush in order to ensure that he can remain in the game as long as possible. Those extra min stacks turn into an overheal and some extra int, which is special defense. Those duels, well, if he gets that awareness, you're going to be looking at a good amount of healing there too. You also get the massive amount of acceleration with those buffs, and you also get the purge effects. Really, all in all, Lex is probably, arguably, one of the most perfect leaders for Hush if you're looking to be running a very disruptive game. Of course, Lex appreciates what Hush brings to the table, dealing with blues that Lex otherwise might have issues with, and providing silences for characters that Lex might just not have the tank ability to handle being hit by if they were to use a larger ability. It really helps to cement the advantage that Lex would provide. Going beyond this, we have Chemo. Now, Chemo is a character that lives and dies by the Doom. So, he's going to be a character that you're going to want to maximize the possibility of that Doom going off, in addition to his other more obvious slowing qualities like Fallout. Now, Hush does a very fantastic job of doing this. You target the enemy Purger, you basically remove them from the equation, and those Dooms are going to become a much higher threat. Paired with this, the fact that Hush is able to become incredibly tanky on his own, thanks to all of those mins, all of those awareness, and you have a character who can run the long game and make sure that Chemo gets that full value from each Doom. Moving on, we have, of course, Martian Manhunter. That extra acceleration is always nice. The extra awareness is always nice. You have the stun purge, getting people out of your way. You have the debuff immunity outside of your duel. You have the benefit of having those assist calls, plus the extra chance for awareness. Really, Martian Manhunter provides basically everything that Hush really wants. And mind you, Hush doesn't really provide many things that Martian Manhunter cares about, but anything that lets you seize that advantage is going to be beneficial to have. Next, we have Robin. Robin is probably, memory serving, the fastest silencing character in the game. And it's a guaranteed silence at that. So it's definitely something to consider. Now, keeping in mind, of course, Robin is going to have to put off his invisibility for a turn while you have him using his third ability on the enemy. However, that being said, you do have ways around this using one of the other synergies we're going to talk about next, Clayface, to ensure that Robin stays invisible. Beyond this, of course, you also have the benefit that if you have Robin as your leader, then he's actually able to give Hush even more capability to stay hidden in the shadows. And again, pairing this with Clayface, who is immune to critical hits, you more or less have that ability to just perpetually stay hidden and stay healthy. Of course, Clayface, as mentioned before, is going to be the next synergy that we mentioned. Silences people when he gets hit, is a big hunk of meat in the way. You can go invisible to help him proc his passive. He provides some speed downs. All in all, it's just a good combination, something to consider. But again, you have to worry about the fact that Wonder Girl is going to hard counter your team even harder than it did before with Hush around. Because now even if Clayface loses all of his benefits, you're still going to have Hush with all of his massive stacks of buffs. And I think for the final synergy that we're going to go over, just for the sake of keeping this as brief as possible, let's go ahead and talk about the character that is the Riddler. Now, a lot of people write off the Riddler and say, well, he's C-tier trash, who cares, he's not doing anything. Not quite so, believe it or not. So, his Forced Duel puts 8 agility downs on the opponent, which I probably don't need to tell you. That's a lot of agility downs. That's going to be a lot of damage that Hush is able to put into that target. Beyond that, you also have the massive amount of speed control, which works well with Hush's ability to apply silence to multiple people, because then you have the prospect of everyone's slow enough that now everyone's silenced. Now every time anyone attacks, you have a chance of just continuing that silence forever. Of course, beyond this, you also have the stun effect. You also have the fact that you are applying a taunt to characters while also gaining true sight. So, assuming that you get that reset, you can actually just go ahead and taunt up whoever you want to target with Hush, which is always handy. Paired with someone like World's Greatest Detective, you can basically do the same thing, but Riddler lets you take that benefit and increase it even further because you get the assist call and you're getting the extra agility down. In a physically led team, Riddler does a fair amount. So he's definitely someone that you might not consider otherwise, that you definitely should. And also it carries with it a little bit of funny irony about how in the animated movies, well, I'll just let you see and find out for yourself. No spoilers on this one. Now then, let's go over the counters. Now for these characters, of course you're going to want to consider characters that could just outright kill Hush. Characters that can stop his momentum early or stop him from gaining momentum at all. Or characters that honestly just don't mind being silenced. So of course, off the bat, we have to consider the likes of Arcus. Because, well, Arcus is the hardest counter to Hush. Arcus really doesn't mind too much once he gets going, whatever Hush is doing. Because Hush can't apply silence with Arcus's debuff immunity. Arcus is more than happy to take a hit from Hush and then just retaliate back and kill him. And you always run the risk of using your duel against an Arcus to try to force that silence, and then not getting that silence off, and he whips back and smacks you if you don't get the awareness. Honestly, it's just not a fight you want to have. And that's true for most characters against Arcus, but especially for Hush. Next up is Doomsday. Now, Doomsday is another character that you wouldn't really think of in terms of, oh, well, a lot of people use him, and in fairness, a lot of people don't. But if you do run into a Doomsday for whatever reason, just don't bring Hush to that fight. Doomsday wants to be silenced. Doomsday wants to use his first ability, and that's it. In fact, the only thing that really holds Doomsday back is the fact that the AI is terrible and doesn't know how to use his kit. You basically correct the AI using your kit, which is something that is just a bad sign when you walk into a match and make an enemy character better by merit of debuffing them. All in all, his damage output's high. You're never going to be able to kill him one-on-one. And no matter how much awareness you stack up, it's just going to become a game where you eventually stop damaging him. So, all things considered, avoid it if you can. Next up, of course, we have Kilowog, CAGA, Cersei, any meter drain characters in general, Chemo, of course, being added. Now, what makes these characters dangerous is, of course, Hush is a slow guy, and he's very reliant on grabbing that early momentum and riding it. So, with the likes of Kilowog or Cersei, if you get the meter down in a stun, Hush is dead in the water. There's nothing he can do, because he's not able to gain any of momentum. With CAGA, it's a little less so, but CAGA is really good at popping those buffs off of him when he gains the mins, when he gains the awareness and such. So definitely something you can't avoid because they're everywhere, but something you should probably prepare an answer for, if not prepare some way to get Hush around that issue. Next up, of course, we have the likes of Hawkgirl. Now, I know you might be thinking, oh, but if I use King's Gambit, I'm debuff immune. She can't stun me. Well, that is true, but there are two main issues with that line of logic. First off, is that typically when you're running Hawkgirl, you're not just running Hawkgirl. You're running a lot of characters that are capable of stunning. The likes of Hal Jordan, the likes of Martian Manhunter, so on and so forth. So you really can't avoid the stun just because you can avoid Hawkgirl. And beyond that, as it happens, Hawkgirl is 1 speed faster than you. So if she gets a clean shot at you, you're not getting that duel off. Now, of course, you can remedy this by picking Cheetah, picking Martian, picking really anyone with acceleration. 1 speed is not hard to make up. But at the end of the day, you're still having to add that extra build-in order to get around this character that, if you don't have that build-in, is going to crit immune your team so you can't do any damage, is going to purge off your silences, and is going to stun you and beat you to death with a mace. It's just not what you want to be walking into. Wonder Girl is next. For obvious reasons, you are stacking a ton of buffs, and Wonder Girl loves that. She wants to eat those buffs up. You do counter her to some very small degree by being able just to punch her out of existence, but at the end of the day, you're still running into the issue that, well, she doesn't need to be unsilenced in order to use her passive, and that's what's mainly going to be what's breaking you down. You're going to walk into a match, you're going to stack up so many mins, and then it's Whiptown, USA. Beyond that, of course, we have Superman. Now, Superman doesn't counter you in the traditional way where he beats you to death like every other character on this list, but rather it counters you in a more indirect way, where he prevents you from targeting who you want to target, purges off your silences, and more or less just makes you a much less effective Hush. In this case, against Superman, I do recommend just bringing a character that can take those taunts off of him, or alternatively, can just kill him outright. But Superman's very tanky, very hard to deal with, and there will come times where you just outright lose a match because your answer to him is gone. So definitely something to consider. Of course, a lot of these characters you can't really avoid because they're everywhere, but these are things you have to take in mind when you are building your team. And of course, for the final character on this, we are going to have to, of course, consider the likes of Larfleeze, because you gaining the benefit from killing his allies is also going to be something that he himself benefits from. Now, of course, you might consider, okay, but what about Black Mask then? Well, Black Mask can be handled by the fact that you have debuff immunity to some extent. You can just avoid the debuffs that Black Mask will put on you. With Larfleeze, he doesn't worry about the debuffs. He just does raw damage. On top of that, you have the issue that he can steal your awareness buffs or your debuff immunity, and even if you silence him, that laser's still gonna hit and it's still gonna hurt really badly. So, definitely someone you're going to want to avoid if you see him, or again, you're going to want to bring an answer to put him down right out of the gate. Now then, since we've gone over the synergies and counters, let's go ahead and go over the team compositions that you might want to consider when using your Hush. Keep in mind, these aren't all of the team compositions that are possible, much like how the previous synergies and counters weren't all of the synergies and counters that existed for Hush. This is just a general view of different aspects of his kit and different teams that can highlight that. And from this, of course, I hope you gain the insight to consider these options and consider how your own roster might be able to enhance his kit and develop it in a way that allows you to accomplish some of the things that these compositions will do. First off, we have a composition that I find rather fun, and the point of the composition should be pretty obvious right out of the gate. We have a Medfill lead with Chemo, Green Arrow Castaway, and Hush. Now, as you probably realize, this is a very heavy meter control team, with a lot of stalling tactics between Medfill and Hush, paired with a lot of damage, not burst damage, mind you, but consistent damage, and a whole heck of a lot of slowdown between CAGA's multi-shot and invisible arrows, between Chemo's Fallout, between Medfill's Hypnotic Lights. All of this allowing Hush to gain the most benefit by allowing him the most opportunity to hit different targets with his silence and gain that counteract, train, get it rolling. So, in this composition, generally what you're going to want to do is you'll open up with someone like, say, CAJ's Multi-Shot. You'll follow that up with Medfill's Hypnotic Light, shutting one opponent out of the fight. You'll probably follow that up with Hush's Silence, shutting a second opponent out of the fight, followed by Chemo's Fallout. Now, assuming you're doing everything right, you should, in theory at least, be able to take your next turn before the opponent gets one. Now, of course, this does have some issues. Obviously, if the opponent's running something like a Cheater or Martian composition, then you're going to fall behind and you can be counteracted. But beyond that one aspect of it, the team is incredibly good at crushing most other teams, just grinding them down. Your matches won't be over fast, but they will end in your favor. Next, we have a composition that I personally use, being Lex Luthor as a leader, Artemis, Hush, and Solomon Grundy. Now, this one should be a bit more obvious in the way that it's a execution style team. Artemis, obviously, with her huge upfront damage, Solomon Grundy with his huge upfront damage, Lex Luthor with his huge upfront damage, plus the acceleration in the buff composition, allows Hush to find targets that the other three don't finish off and just pick them off thanks to his passive, and also thanks to his third ability's meter gain. Now, this team composition also, of course, Lex Luthor does provide the silence support, Artemis provides some control with her stun, Grundy's just a big old sack of meat, he sits in the way. All in all, this composition is going to provide you with equal parts sustain and throughput that is going to make it a lot better of a team versus teams that rely heavily on grinding you down because you can outlast it. So this is going to be teams like Cassandra Cain, comps, and those types of things. However, the main weakness for this one, kind of like the last one, is that even though Artemis herself is kind of fast, the rest of the team is kind of slow. So you are unfortunately going to have to deal with that fact. But all things considered, there's not really much that this team can't kill. So you really shouldn't have too much issues with it. The next composition is going to be Hippolyta as a leader, with Hush, Donna Troy, and Arcus Chummock. Now this one should also be pretty obvious what your main intent is going in with it. You're going to be loading up those buffs with Hippolyta. You're going to be throwing out duels left and right with Arcus and Hush. And Donna Troy is going to be providing protection and support, not only through the meter gain and the awareness stacks, but also through her cooldown reduction. meaning Hippolyta can chain back to back to back to back to back buffs if she needs to. It means Hush can duel and use his execution more often. It means that Arcus has a lot less downtime between when he uses his duel and when he can use his next one. So this one is probably going to be a bit more direct and a lot more simple in its execution. This is going to be a team composition that you're going to bring into a fight that you have select targets that are maybe not as well protected as they should be, and you want to just end the fight right out of the gate. Now, of course, just like as before, against Cheetah comps and Martian comps, it's really not hard to get Dawn out of the way and target the other specific characters, but you do carry the benefit that Donna's awareness should buy you at least a little extra time. Next, we have the composition of Cheetah, Batman, World's Greatest Detective, Hush, and Chemo. Now, of course, this one is going to take more of a standard bleed composition style and switch it up a bit. So the main counteracting force to bleed teams is going to be Purgers. And of course, there's a fair amount of Purgers throughout the game. Lots of them can just knock stuff off of the enemy characters, but this is where Hush comes in. He can lock down those Purgers and make sure that the enemy has to take those bleeds, has to take those dooms. This is made even more possible by the fact that Cheetah can ravage and purge tank out of the way. Batman can provide true sight, allowing Hush to target whoever he needs to. And Chemo provides speed control to ensure that Hush is able to dip in and out as he is required. This composition provides Hush with everything that he realistically needs. It gives him extra damage between the strength ups and affinity ups. It gives him extra speed between the blood in the air and the synthesized cure, which, mind you, creates a very potent combination where he's able to execute duel and have an extra turn, or is able to duel someone down to execute range and take an extra turn. And then, of course, you also have the benefit of having free range with the true sight benefit. So, all things considered, a very strong composition, and a composition that very often will go first and will be able to lock down these characters thanks to Cheetah's initial boost. Next, we have a team composition that's a bit more focused on the grinder side of things. So we have Saint Walker as your leader, you have Hush, you have Guy Gardner, and you have Harley Quinn, Mad Jester. Now, of course, this composition is going to be more focused around the idea of taking large, later set abilities out of the game with Hush. So, as an example, going in and seeing a character like Green Lantern Hal Jordan and thinking to yourself, oh, well, I need to step in and remove his ability to stun. Of course, that wouldn't be the case because Hush is a little slower, but you get the general idea. Basically, Hush is going to walk in, find a target, and then lock them down, making sure that Harley Quinn's able to make the most of her evasions and Guy Gardner is able to make the most of his retaliations. Likewise, with Saint Walker giving you that extra boost, your execution passive actually becomes very potent. And combined with Saint Walker's assist calling capabilities, you have a very real chance of putting silences on everyone. So definitely something to consider. Now, of course, this team does have a downside, being that a lot of characters have can't miss on their basics. But that's something that you can work around just with a little bit of sorting with your team. Maybe replacing Guy Gardner for a different green, or maybe replacing Harley Quinn for a different tank. Now, finally, we are going to have a composition based on going first 100% of the time. This one is going to be Martian Manhunter, Hush, Cheetah, and Owlman. Now, of course, Owlman providing the crit chance ups is going to mean your team is going to have a lot of damage output, especially with Hush's duel. Cheetah and Martian together mean that there's not really going to be a team out there that's going to go before you, for the most part. And then beyond that, of course, you have the good amount of purges between Martian's Punch and Cheetah's Ravage. You have Hush going in, dueling people, landing big meaty crits or executing with big meaty crits. You have Owlman increasing your hit chance, allowing you to get around evasion. So you have a pretty decent composition in terms of just taking that initiative and making the most of it. Now, would I recommend this team? It does have the slight weakness, as with a lot of comps that Hush is on, that Wonder Girl kind of wrecks shop if you don't deal with her very quickly. But between Owlman and Hush and all of the Purgers that can get things out of the way, you shouldn't have too much issue removing Wonder Girl before she slaughters everyone, especially with Martian Manhunter's initial awareness. So that concludes the insight into this character, Hush. Now let's go ahead and look back at the question we had posed initially. Is this character worth it? Should we be buying the packs? I think it could be pretty safely assumed that no. And let me go ahead and explain my reasoning as to why here, in this conclusion. So Hush, as a character, mind you, is very good at what he does, and is very good for what he is. However, you do have to keep in mind that what he is and what he does aren't necessarily highly demanded niches in the current meta. That isn't even accounting for the fact that most of the counters we listed are very prevalent in the meta, just more so that he is contesting a very, very popular and very hotly contested spot. There are no shortage of high damage reds out there. You have Azrael, you have Artemis, you have Booster Gold. And likewise, in terms of control characters, there's just better ones out there. You have CHA, you have the likes of Hawkgirl, you have the likes of Medfill, you have the likes of Kilowog, Chemo. Lots of characters are able to just be more impactful with what they do. Now, keeping in mind, he does bring some stuff to the table. Execution style passive is always handy, given that some characters' breakpoints are just shy. But if you need something like that, you can go with Huntress. If you need silence in your composition, there's just better characters that can bring you silence. You got characters like Lex Luthor, for example, who provides silence in addition to providing tons of other benefit. Now, is Hush bad? No. Hush, I would not say is a bad character. I would probably personally rank him high B or low A tier, because for what it's worth, he does handle characters that he needs to handle relatively well. It's just the downside that the combination of his poor speed and his, for the most part, serviceable but mediocre damage makes him just not a prime candidate for your money's investment. I would say probably save it more for Azrael later on in the month, because he's looking like he's going to be a very, very, very omnipresent threat from here on out. But, of course, that is a tale for another time. In terms of this specific insight, Hush is a good character. He's worth doing the free campaign for, but I would not recommend buying the pack. Thank you for joining us, and hopefully you'll be joining us next time when we go over the character of Azrael and seeing whether or not you should buy the pack for him. I have a sinking suspicion that you probably should. Alright, thanks for listening, everybody. Hopefully you enjoyed, and we will see you next time. Bye-bye.